This is Talk the Home of Common Sense with me, Julia Hartley-Brewer. Sam Armstrong still with us. Joining us now, I'd like to say, the Director of Popular Conservatism. That's Mark Littlewood. Very good afternoon to you, Mark.
Hi, Julia.
Hello.
Good to be with you.
Thank you very much for joining us. Now, I wanted to talk to you about MPs' expenses, but let's talk very briefly about MEPs' expenses with Marine Le Pen, the leader of the National Rally in France. She has been convicted of embezzlement of EU MEP funds, basically to fund, along with other MEPs, to fund the French political office of National Rally rather than their MEP work. She has been, as part of her sentence, she has been banned from being able to stand at France's next presidential election in 2027, being banned from political office for 5 years. She's also faced a 4-year sentence. 2 years prison sentence going to be suspended, we now understand, while the other 2 will be spent with electronic tag rather than in custody. So not actually facing time behind bars, also a €100,000 fine. What do you make of the charges against her, the sentence regarding her standing in public office? We've seen, of course, what happened with lawfare, many viewed as with Donald Trump. Do you think the same could happen here with a figure like, say, Nigel Farage?
Yeah, Julia, I think this is very worrying. I can't really speak to the precise detail of whether she misused funds. Obviously, I haven't had time to read the court judgment in full. I get the gist of it, but whether she's due a fine or a suspended sentence or in custody at home, I guess I'd leave that to the court. What I'm worried about is when courts can prohibit you from running for public office. Yeah. That should be a decision entirely for the electorate. Now, I guess if you're successfully charged with embezzlement, a good chunk of the electorate might not look favourably upon your candidature. Yeah. So it's likely to hit you politically and electorally. But I think this should be a judgment for the French people, not for the French court.
Well, indeed.
As far as her eligibility is concerned.
But it's like MPs who are convicted of a certain level of crime in a certain sentence. I think there's a year behind bars, potentially. We've seen, Mike Amesbury and, the by-election we're going to have there as a result of him being convicted of criminal assault. But, if you're sentenced to above a certain amount in this country, if you're a sitting MP, you then have to face a recall. You can face a recall petition if more than 10% of people in your local constituency say we'd like to have another election. Yeah, you fall as the MP, but you've got every right to stand again yourself. You probably won't be selected by your own party, but you could stand as an independent, for instance. So people are still allowed to stand for office. Someone could be a convicted murderer or rapist or goodness knows what. But if people wanted to elect them for office, that's kind of the choice of the people, isn't it?
I think that's right, Julia, and I think I would also ensure that some sort of parliamentary standards commission can't prohibit you from sitting in Parliament for a particular period of time, thereby triggering a recall. You're quite right with regard to Mike Amesbury. He could seek re-election if he wants. I mean, I guess his chances would be somewhere between thin and zero, but nevertheless, it would ultimately be up to the electorate. So you've got in Marine Le Pen somebody who, I'm not quite sure if she's the odds-on favourite, but considered to have a fairly good chance of winning the French presidential election. As I say, I dare say this judgment, you would expect, all things equal, would knock her back in the polls. But nevertheless, in my view, her name should go forward. And you mentioned possibilities in the UK that could be similar to this, Julia, but we also saw this in the USA. Yeah. That the principal campaign against Donald Trump was to try to prohibit him from actually getting on the ballot paper, not to defeat him in an election. So we've got to get back, I think, right across the Western world to the true concept of democracy, which is put your name forward and let the people decide, not the judges.
I think the people largely get it right, actually. If you look at all the elections in this country and elsewhere, I think if you actually look at the choices available, they largely, the wisdom of crowds does work a lot of the time, doesn't it? Not most of the time. Let's talk about where the authorities should get involved, though, because the House of Commons has been told by government ministers that it should change its what they call absurd rules, letting MPs claim expenses for their pets. This is after the Labour MP for Coventry North West, who was actually a Labour whip, Taiwo Obatemi, she claimed £900 on her IPSO expenses as an MP, which was approved. It wasn't like she didn't put it in for the duck house and it got disallowed as pet rent for her cockapoo, Bella. Now, apparently this is a surcharge. This is apparently quite often. It's a long time since I rented, but the landlord basically charges for having a pet stay at her second home in London. That charge is passed on to the taxpayer. But I mean, quite apart from that, I mean, the fact that it costs you quite a lot. On Cockapoos, thousands to purchase. I'm pretty sure these pedigree dogs sell for absolute thousands as puppies. That I think most people who are worrying about, and we're going to be talking about this next, you know, the bills going up, the council tax going up, you know, and paying all these extra bills coming in tomorrow or April the 6th, that actually having to pay the extra pet rent for this cockapoo for an MP, well, might feel, should we say, a little unfair?
Yeah, you're right, Julia. I mean, this one does seem pretty egregious, doesn't it? I think the problem we've still got with MPs' expenses is it's very unclear what we would consider to be on the right side of the line and the wrong side of the line. I guess your pet seems to be on the wrong side of the line. Well, we'd probably accept that an MP needs to have, I don't know, broadband in their London apartment. Should we pay for that? Does it need to be super fast broadband? We'd probably accept they need a television set. Does it need to be a 4D top-end television set? I think we've got to, you know, if they've got kids, can they have a bigger apartment so their kids can stay over in London? All of this is very vague. We'd be much better to move to a system whereby MPs have, if you like, a London allowance for each night they need to be there. And kind of what they spend it on is up to them, whether they stay in a hotel or buy themselves an apartment. But you give them, I don't know, £300 a night for sake of argument, and they disperse that as they see fit.
But we have had the ridiculous situation.
There are people always returning to this.
Yeah, there are people who after the expenses scandal in 2008, MPs who already own a second home in London, they've got a home, or they live in London, they've got a second home in their constituency. Of course, they swap over which is a second home or not, depending on whether they're selling it and want to avoid capital gains tax, or whether they're furbishing it and they want the taxpayer to pay. Then they just kind of swap it around. But we did see the situation where, because they were told, well, you can no longer buy a flat, buy a second home, and then pay the mortgage on the taxpayer, and then make, you know, sometimes a couple of £100,000 in profit when you sell the flat, when you leave office, you could only pay rent. So you've got the absurd situation of people who own a second flat in London and another MP, and they swap over and they both rent each other's flats because they can get rent for it, but they can't get the mortgage for it. It doesn't work. This system doesn't work.
No, you're quite right, Julia. And of course, in any system, it always gets gamed. That's a very complex way of gaming the system. But guess what? MPs have worked it out. So I would have thought it'd be much better to move to the sort of system that many companies operate on. That if we send you away on business, you get X amount for your food and drink and Y amount for a hotel. And where you stay and what you eat and what you drink is up to you. There's your slice of money. And if you don't spend it all, you can keep the rest. So you work out a fair subsistence allowance for having to stay overnight in London whilst Parliament is in session. You give every MP that, and whether they stay in a hotel, in an Airbnb, put that to buying a house or sleep under Waterloo Bridge should be a matter for them.
That's a very good point. I rather like that. Mark Littlewood, thank you very much indeed for joining us.